ventilation, they provide waterproofing, they provide coloration for birds, whether that's cryptic coloration or sexual signaling, and also protection for other feathers. The one problem with feathers is they're so lightweight that they break down relatively quickly and have to be replaced. You can see that outer primaries in this scope have broken down or just about the end of their functional use. So to cope with this, birds replace their feathers in regular intervals and generally following stereotype strategies. So these two feathers right here, nice new feathers starting to grow, and pretty soon this bird's going to have a full set of fresh feathers. One of my main interests is when birds do and should molt their feathers, how birds decide when to molt their feathers. And we have a fair bit of evidence that suggests that resources that are available for feather growth have to do with the costs associated with molting. So some birds that try to molt with few available resources will grow in low quality feathers, and those costs approach and even get to mortality at some points. And of course, resources vary both spatially and temporally. Similarly, you can imagine that feather utility, which has to do with the integrity of the old feather you're replacing, plus immediate need for any feather at any one time, also affects the cost of molt. And feather utility and use for different feathers vary with life history. Different species of birds use the same feathers for different things. Even some species within the year change what they use feathers for. So when we put this together, we can start to get a picture of the trade-offs and variation that lead to different molting strategies of birds. We can break down the benefits of molt into two main categories, which might be phenotype alteration. So this is two pictures of the same species of ptarmigan, changing its feathers in order to blend in with the rocky habitat in the summer and snowy habitat in the winter, or just structural removal, birds replacing feathers that have worn so much that they're not functionally useful anymore. So there are lots of different, there's lots of different kinds of variation in molt strategies. I'm just going to be talking about two basic ones today. We have first a very simple strategy, which we call a basic strategy, where birds just grow all their feathers once a year. Just every year they replace all their feathers. We call this the pre-basic molt following a basic strategy. And there's an alternate strategy to this where birds can replace their feathers twice a year. So we have this pre-basic molt, the same as here, and then they insert a molt into that annual cycle, and it's almost always a partial molt. So they replace all their feathers, then they some of those, all feathers, some of those. We call this the alternate strategy, and this molt the pre-alternate molt. There's a good bit of evidence, or some evidence, that prealternate molt has arisen many times in many different unrelated families across the tree of, avian tree of life. And the sort of conventional wisdom for a long time has been that prealternate molt has arisen to deal with differential selection throughout the year. So birds that are breeding might have selection for brighter plumage, and birds that aren't breeding might have selection for crypsis. So to study this, we looked at the New World warblers. They have diversity in plumage brightness, seasonal dimorphism, sexual dimorphism, prealternate molt, migration extent, and latitudinal ranges. And we also have a nice, well-resolved Phylogeny from the London lab at Cornell to work with. So just to give you some idea of the seasonal dimorphism in this group, we have some birds that do not go through an pre-alternate molt, they just retain their basic plumage all year. Some birds that go through pre-alternate molt that doesn't change their plumage aspect at all. So they replace feathers with the new feathers just like the old ones. Some that have a little bit of phenotypic change, and then some that the pre-alternate molt results in extensive phenotype change. And you can see the same individual bird in the summer and the winter and not think it was the same species if you didn't know. There's also well-known latitudinal dimorphism gradient in these species. And I'll point out that this is both present in sexual dimorphism and seasonal dimorphism. And one of the ideas put forward, and I'll come back to this, Simpson's hypothesis here, is that this results in selection for crypsis in warblers that are migrating, such that females develop more cryptic plumage if they have to migrate farther distances. So one of my main questions with this project, with this study, is what causes variation in both seasonal and sexual dimorphism in this group? And also, does prealternate molt evolve, or does it function to alter phenotype, or is it to replace worn feathers? So to assess this, we scored molt and dimorphism using mainly museum specimens at LSU, but also literature. And we broke the birds up into a bunch of main areas, a few main categories on the body, the head, back, breast, etc., and the feather tracks on the wing. And we scored each one of these for both sexual and seasonal dimorphism and extent or presence of prealternate molt. So if we just look at the relative extent of prealternate molt on the tree, we can see there are some similar patterns. This cartoon warbler here is just shaded by the relative extent of prealternate molt across the whole family. So some feather tracts are molted more than others. We also see that it's fairly well spread out across the tree. If we just add up those columns, we can get a vector of extent of prealternate molt, which just tells us how much in general of the body is involved in prealternate molt. And if we look at this as a discrete character, just whether birds have prealternate molt or not, it seems like this is a basal characteristic to the family. So the species that don't have prealternate molt are ones that have lost it over evolutionary time. So does prealternate molt account for sexual dimorphism? Doesn't seem like it. We don't have any evidence for that. But when we compare prealternate molt to seasonal dimorphism, we have a pretty strong result. And I'll mention that these are phylogenetic independent contrasts, so this is all robust to phylogenetic non-independence of our samples. And we do actually have a fairly strong, a weak but significant relationship between sexual and seasonal dimorphism. And what this probably means is just that seasonally dimorphic males during the winter generally look more like females during the winter, and they look less like females during the summer. We measured migration distance using a variety of different vectors, but the results are similar. So the one I'll talk about today is number 1 here. So we just measure the farthest distance in the breeding range to the farthest distance in the wintering range. And we also split the warblers up into long distance migrants, non-migrants, which don't migrate at all, so we didn't generate any vectors here, and partial migrants. When we look at data over the tree, we also see there's a fair bit of variation. We also recovered an agreement with previous studies that migration is a basal strategy in this group, and non-migrant warblers that have lost migration, seem to have lost migration. So does migration distance account for sexual dimorphism? This is the Simpson's hypothesis. We don't really find any support for that. And we also don't really find any support that migration distance causes evolution of seasonal dimorphism. However, when we compare migration distance to the extent of prealternate molt, we recover a pretty strong and very significant relationship, again, that's robust to phylogenetic non-independence. So when we break this up into feather tracts, we find some parts of the body, the prealternate molt is much more tightly linked to migration than other parts of the body. And this seems like it may sort of follow a threshold pattern where below a certain migration distance, birds aren't doing prealternate molt, and then above a certain migration distance, by feather tracts, some do and some don't. And as we go farther down migration distance, we pass thresholds for various tracts, and they add up, and that may be causing this relationship between extent of prealternate molt and migration distance, perhaps. And again, this is robust phylogenetic non-independence. So why would prealternate molt be related to migration? Are feathers just breaking down from birds flying? Well, we know that solar radiation, especially ultraviolet radiation, is a major contributor to feather breakdown. That's why we have to keep museum specimens in drawers and away from the light. When we look at the feathers that are involved in prealternate molt and the feathers that are tightly linked to migration, there seem to be the feathers that are exposed to solar radiation more. These wing feathers in perch birds are tucked under each other and under coverts, and in general the rectrices are folded under each other. So to look at this, we just looked at day length for each species by month over the year and added this up. And when we compare day length to migration in these species, we have a really strong relationship. And this makes sense, this makes intuitive sense. So birds that are migrating farther have longer days in the summer and the winter than residents, either in temperate or tropical latitudes. And when we compare day length to the extent of prealternate molt, we also have really strong relationships. And when we look within the feather tracts, we have very similar relationships to migration distance, which makes sense because it's so tightly linked to day length. But in these feather tracts, now we have intuitive relationships. Now these are the feather tracts that are more tightly linked to day length are the feather tracts that are more exposed to solar radiation. So we may have some sort of answer there. So is migration related to sexual dimorphism or seasonal dimorphism? We don't really find much evidence for that, but we do find a bit of a link between sexual and seasonal dimorphism. But if we stick prealternate molt in there, we can get from migration to seasonal dimorphism pretty easily. We have strong relationships between migration and prealternate molt and migration and seasonal dimorphism. And if we add solar radiation to this model, we have strong relationship between migration and solar exposure, and a strong and intuitive relationship between solar exposure and prealternate molt based on which feathers are more tightly linked to it. And we can sort of get all the way from migration to seasonal and even sexual dimorphism if we look at these parameters. So how does migration influence dimorphism? The kind of conventionalism that needs for seasonal dimorphism from differential selection throughout the year causes prealternate molt in order to alter phenotype throughout the year. We don't really find support for that in the system. Nor do we find support for Simpson's hypothesis that migration directly leads to sexual dimorphism. Our analysis seems to suggest a slightly more complicated model where migration leads to increased solar exposure, which potentially breaks down feathers more, which leads to prealternate molt for structural renewal, which then can be co-opted for phenotypic alteration. And I want to remind you guys that both prealternate molt and migration, we're generally looking at losses here. So birds that have prealternate molt that are altering phenotype throughout the year, once they lose migration, it seems like they lose prealternate molt and that ability to alter their phenotype throughout the year to cope with these potentially differential selective pressures. And with that, I may have a second for some questions. Thanks for coming.
Do you have any migratory double breeders in the farm?
Not that we know of. We don't think so, but so there's some evidence in some neural birds, a little bit of indirect evidence for migratory double breeding, but there's no good evidence that I know within this group. We don't think so, but that
Would anything weird happen?
it's hard to know. I would guess that a migratory double breeder would not go through a second molt because in general birds don't breed and molt at the same time, and if they breed breed twice, it's that's really physiologically costly. And that probably would leave with a lot of leftover energy put into more time.
I was just curious if you have tried playing around with maybe the coloration itself, the extent of the normalization, as maybe a factor in analyses. I'm just thinking that might be related to the federation.
Like which colors exactly? Yeah, that's a great idea in and of itself. So we started this project taking spectral readings off specimens, and when we were looking at the spectra, we were having a hard time getting the spectra to reflect the dimorphism that we knew we were seeing. And so this is something that we're tweaking and trying to get right. If it still doesn't work, that's a really good idea. It's probably something that we'll put in there, whether darker feathers are more or less related to replacement. There's an idea that darker feathers, have more to do with feather wear via bacteria, and that's why kind of eastern warblers have darker feathers. But that's a really good idea. Hopefully we can get at that with actually looking at the spectra, if we can get it to, again, reflect the dimorphism that we know we're seeing in the specimens.
You based all this analysis on a tree that is product of concatenation. Do you think that your results would change if you happen to have like a phylogenetic species tree? Or are there areas of the tree that we would feel
It could. I don't think these results would change in general. Again, just an ongoing project. The next step here is to account for phylogenetic uncertainty within the tree in these analyses, which we very easily can do. I just haven't yet. So that's a good question, and I think I'll address it soon. My guess is that it's not going to affect the results because we're really just using the phylogenetic to account for phylogenetic non-independence of the samples. Anything else? Okay. Thanks for coming.